Sean, you've been very silent on the Challenger tanks. So we've not heard any news on it lately. It was big news at the beginning. So I guess my first question is how many are left in action?
It's quite topical in a way because the UK was at the forefront of getting tanks actually into Ukraine's hands, modern weapon battle tanks. If you remember, we gave 14 Challenger 2s, and actually they're probably not the right tank for Ukraine, not least of which that there aren't that many in the world. Secondly, are that we couldn't afford to give more than 14. But what we did do is open the door for the international community to give Leopard 2s and Abrams tanks from the US. So the question was, okay, what's happened to these 14? Well, one was very, very high profile, destroyed back in September last year. Pictures of the burning Hulk were evidence to that. But what about the other 13 and how are they being used? Because apparently they were in Russia itself. That actually, you remember that Kursk incursion? Apparently they were used in that. The trouble is, how many are actually working? I understand there are 7 out of the 13 working. And yet Ukrainians say they're really good, they're really reliable. Part of the problem is when a part gets broken, they can't nip down to the Waitrose and get a spare. And apparently it's taking months to get spares. So what you do is you Christmas tree the tank. What that means is you choose a tank and then you just use it for spares. So you take off the bit from that. So that becomes long term, not being used. How the tank's being used? Because they've got a very accurate barrel going out a long way, they're being used as long-range artillery, because out to about 4.5 kilometres, they largely hit what they aim at, which is unusual for tanks.
And it's very mobile as well, of course.
And very mobile.
Yeah.
The problem is with that is that my understanding is because they have a rifle barrel and unique ammunition, it's a pain in the ass to keep them logistically supported because you've had to got a complete supply chain only for the 7 Challenger tanks that are out there. But secondly, because it relies on this rifle barrel for accuracy, most barrels will last, I think, for about 1,000 firings, whereas it's about half that number for the rifle barrels. And therefore, you want to use these tanks to use their barrel for long-range artillery rather than conventional tank battles. But as soon as you do that, you run out of life on the barrels. So
there's a whole new barrel that's needed to
a whole new barrel
up to 500.
Yeah. Up to 500 firings. So by all accounts, and the only other thing that Ukrainians complain about, it's not powerful enough. It's got a 1,200 horsepower engine. It's not powerful enough. Why is that? Because it's one of the heaviest tanks out there, 70 odd tons. And most of the equivalent battle tanks like the Leopard 2s and whatever have about 1,500 horsepower. So they have a significantly more horsepower.
Oh, okay.
Why does that matter? It matters because when they get bogged down in relatively light mud, which they do all the time in Ukraine, they end up having to be dragged out. So, they are proving their worth. Only half of them are running around at the moment. The Ukrainians like them as a tank, but they're not really using them as a tank very much at the moment. And it is a pain in the arse having bespoke ammunition.
And I guess with the wet weather coming and winter coming, the problem you just described is going to get worse.
Exactly right. And the question therefore is how do you actually end up using them? And the problem is they use them in a way they weren't designed to be used. And therefore, of course, they're not ideally suited to that at all. But what I do understand is in the coming days, weeks and months that Ukraine is promised even more Leopard 1 tanks, not just Leopard 2. I'm not sure there's any more Abrams on their way, but there is a steady supply of tanks that's being pushed forward. But interestingly, we've done a lot of training for their tank drivers. The thing they're short of? Maintenance guys. Guys who actually know how to take them apart, fix them, and that apparently is a critical shortfall for them.
They need some Remy guys over there.
They do. They absolutely do.
Here's an off-the-cuff question for you then. How do you feel about electric vehicle tanks, i.e. battery operated in this modern world, which I think is one of the subjects being talked about by the current US administration?
I think the danger of battlefield stuff is that you're not there to be green, you're there to be effective. You go to war to win. And one of the challenges, you don't run an electric car at the moment. Have you had an electric car?
I had one for 3 years, Tesla, yeah.
And I got my best man had one for a year, loved it, and then got rid of it because it just wasn't practical. You'd run out of charge, you got this, anxiety around range and stuff like that. That is not something you can easily suffer from in a tank. You need to have a degree of flexibility. You need to be able to top it up with fuel really quickly. It's going to be heavy. It's going to use up its charge. I think the jury's out at the moment. You know, the benefits of doing that. You'd certainly get lots of torque and power. Whether you get the reliability and, more importantly, the range and the flexibility, you know, because the one thing that the challengers, they say that as soon as they get stuck in mud, they're vulnerable. If you've got an electric tank and it stops because it needs charge, it's vulnerable. And that's one thing you just can't afford to have on a battlefield.
Yeah. I guarantee you that it's on Ed Miliband's agenda.
Yeah, we'll see.